Research Webcast. Today's topic is going to be looking at IT executives on LinkedIn, and specifically around the topic of IT hardware. My name is Josh Grosnickel, and I'll be presenting this research. The webcast will take about 30 minutes, leaving about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end of the session. During the presentation, you may ask questions in two areas, either the chat box or the Q&A box located on the right of your screen, and I'll answer all questions at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll make the recording available to you via follow-up email. I think that about covers it for the housekeeping issues. So why don't we jump right into the study that we conducted here at LinkedIn on IT hardware. Today's agenda, we're going to be covering a few areas. I'm going to start by talking about some third-party data that dives into the scale and engagement of the LinkedIn IT audience, really to help you understand why we're able to do such representative and robust research on this low-incidence population here at LinkedIn. And then we'll cover the specific research objectives and the methodology. And then we'll go into the role of LinkedIn in IT hardware decision-making, some of the spending trends of this audience, and we'll finally wrap up with some familiarity and perceptions of various IT hardware brand categories. We have a number of categories in this study. I believe it's 7 total. We'll only have time to dive into a couple today. We'll be looking at computers and mobile communications. So let's start by talking about that scale and engagement of LinkedIn of this IT hardware audience. One of the things that makes this working at LinkedIn as a researcher so exciting is the ability to be able to do representative and robust research into these low incidence populations like IT professionals at scale. You can see here from looking at this Nielsen app plan data that LinkedIn reaches 14 to 35 times more IT professionals every month than many of the other leading technology sites. 1.7 million of these IT professionals came to LinkedIn in the month of January compared to only 127K for ZDNet. But it's not just that we have a lot of IT professionals. The IT professionals that are here are also highly engaged. So on average, these IT professionals consume 34 page views and spent 19 minutes per visitor. So certainly as a researcher, it's very exciting because this allows us to do great research, but also as a marketer, it's a great opportunity to be able to reach IT decision makers at scale. So let's dive into the research specifically that we conducted. Overall, what we wanted to do is acquire insights about IT decision makers as it relates to IT hardware specifically to help marketers better understand and connect with this audience. The 4 areas that we'll be covering are really looking at how IT decision makers are using LinkedIn and looking at the role that professional networks like LinkedIn play in IT decision making. We'll look at some of the spending trends, and we'll also look at brand familiarity and perception amongst LinkedIn IT decision makers. From a methodology standpoint, what did we do? Well, we reached out to IT decision makers on LinkedIn. We surveyed a total of 800 active U.S. LinkedIn members in January 2011, and it was split between 2 different populations. The first, IT professionals, that was 656 respondents, and these were people with titles like manager, director, or VP. And the other is IT leaders, 144 respondents with titles like CIO, CTO, or COO. All respondents had the job function of IT. All respondents were from companies with 200 employees or more. And we used the screening question to ensure that all of the respondents had influence over IT decisions within their organization. So let's dive into the results. To summarize the results, there were three basic areas that we learned. The first of which is that IT decision makers on LinkedIn are one of the most connected and active audiences on the platform. Part of this is due to the fact that IT decision makers are in the technology space, they are early adopters of technology, and they've been on the platform the longest. And there is a strong correlation on LinkedIn between the tenure and length of time and the number of connections and usage. But as we dug deeper into the data, we also found that it's because IT professionals really trust recommendations from colleagues and are actively using LinkedIn to guide their purchase decisions. And finally, we discovered that IT professionals plan to spend significant budget on IT hardware in 2011. Let's start with that role of LinkedIn IT hardware decision makers. So the first question that we asked is to really understand, in your company or institution, what roles do you typically play in purchases of IT products or services? And we're looking at those two populations here, those IT leaders in orange, which are the CXOs, CTOs, and the IT professionals, the managers, directors, and VPs. And you can see that each of them play very important and strong roles in the decision-making process. But the IT professionals really over-index on areas like evaluating vendor offerings, recommending brands to consider, setting tech requirements, while the IT leaders over-index on making that final purchase decision. I think the main takeaway here is that as marketers, when attempting to reach this population and influence decisions, it's important to have a mix of reaching both the IT professionals who are at the beginning phase of the decision and the IT leaders who are making that final decision. Looking at the IT professionals' usage of LinkedIn, what we did is we actually took 87,000 profiles from the database amongst people who we defined as being IT professionals and IT leaders based on profile information in their profile. And we looked at the average number of connections that these individuals had. And you can see those IT leaders, the CIOs and CTOs, had an average of 165 connections on LinkedIn, which is 5 times more than the average user. And those managers, directors, and VPs had an average of 108, which is 3 times more than the average LinkedIn user. So we can see that this particular population is extremely engaged on the platform. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of that has to do with the fact that they are early adopters and have long tenure on the platform, and that's correlated with having more connections and deeper use. But as we'll see in a moment, it's also related to how they're using the platform itself. So looking at that same data set, that same 87,000, and looking behaviorally at where they visit areas on LinkedIn, we see that those IT decision makers are visiting LinkedIn pages that help keep them informed about their network and industry. You can see the number one area that they're visiting is their inbox, where they receive invitations to connect from colleagues or questions from colleagues, visiting profiles where they're looking at other colleagues' information, visiting the homepage where they may see information like LinkedIn Today, news on their industry, groups where they can communicate about what's happening in their industry, visiting company and product pages, and actually at the very bottom, just over 10% are visiting the jobs area of our site. So I think the key takeaway from this slide is that IT professionals and decision makers are really using LinkedIn for a lot more than just jobs. In fact, the vast majority of the usage is outside of the jobs area. We also asked our IT decision makers, when deciding whether to buy a particular IT product or service for your company or institution, would you trust recommendations from the following sources? And far and away, the number one source that IT professionals trust are work colleagues and colleagues within their professional network, 98%. Followed by 81% with value-added resellers and system integrators, and 70% for white papers, and then it falls off to 36% for IT company websites and 8% for IT company advertisements. So it's clear that IT decision makers are looking to their peers for recommendations on what to purchase, and that is the number one driver of choice. When we dug in a little bit further, we then asked the same population, well, who do you think, or what do you think LinkedIn is a good resource for? And then 63% said LinkedIn is a great resource for getting information about IT companies, services, or products. 55% getting advice on how to solve IT product or service challenge. 54% finding recommendations about IT products or services, and 52% staying on top of the latest news and trends on the IT industry. So this data really does show that IT professionals are actively mining and leveraging the LinkedIn platform to make decisions about what products to buy, what products are best for their organization. And they're connecting with their most trusted peers to do this. So, therefore, it's not surprising that when we asked directly of this population, in the past 12 months, did information provided via LinkedIn influence your decision about whether to buy a particular IT product or service? That a significant portion of them said yes. Those IT leaders, the CIOs, CTOs, saying 17% said that it influenced the purchase decision, and 20% of the managers, directors, and VPs saying that. So I think all of that sums up to the fact that LinkedIn is clearly more than just about finding jobs. It really is a resource for IT professionals. So let's dive into the next section, which is around IT hardware budgets in 2011. And granted, when we conducted this survey in January 2011, some of this information was probably a little more compelling than it is right now. But this will serve as an interesting baseline for when we conduct the study again in early 2012. So when we conducted the study, we asked, which of the IT categories below does your company or institution plan to spend at least some of their 2011 budget on? And as you can see, we have it broken out here by company size, 250, 500 to 1,000, etc. And across the board, computers were the number one area that IT professionals were expecting to spend money, followed by servers, then storage and networking devices at around 70, and also mobile phones and voice plans. And then it drops off to printers, and finally landlines and VoIP at around 38% overall. The main difference here that you'll see in the green is that the smaller companies are planning to spend at a higher incidence than some of the larger companies. And I think part of that may be due to the fact that if you're an IT manager in a smaller company, you have greater visibility into the overall spend of your organization versus if you're an IT manager in a 5,000 person company. I don't know that necessarily this data is saying that smaller companies will spend more. Similarly, we can see in the increase in spend from 2011, we have, compared to last year, is the amount of money that your company or institution is going to spend on IT products this year significantly less, about the same, or significantly more. And we see across the board a pretty similar ranking of spend, but with computers and printers being at the top. So printers was previously at the bottom of the list, and now it's kind of come up to second. And servers has gone down a little bit. But the spend level is pretty similar. Again, one of the insights here is looking at the smaller companies, which seem to have the highest percentage of increased spend. Now, let's delve into some of the familiarity and perceptions of various IT hardware categories and brands. As I mentioned in this presentation, we're probably only going to have time to dive into a couple of these. However, we do have 7 total. We'll be looking at computers and mobile communication. The areas that we looked at were computers, services, or servers rather, networking devices, storage, landline communication, mobile communication, and printers. And we'll give you information on how to get access to all that data at the end of the call. So let's start with computers. We asked our respondents a familiarity question. However, it wasn't just standard familiarity. We really asked a bit of a higher bar, which was, which brands do you have enough familiarity with in order to provide opinions about the quality, pricing, and service of those brands? And looking at that data, we can see that Dell is far and away the leader here at 90%, followed by HP at 73%, Apple at 60%, Lenovo at 49%, Toshiba at 32%, Sony at 26%, and Acer at 23%. For many of you on the phone, I'm sure this is not surprising data, and hopefully it's right in line with a lot of the tracking studies that you were doing, and is really something that we feel we're uniquely qualified to do based on how representative the audience of IT decision makers is on LinkedIn. We followed up this particular question with a series of other questions to create this perceptual map of the marketplace. On the vertical axis, we asked those who were familiar what percent would recommend these brands. On that horizontal axis, we asked which of the brands are perceived as high quality. And finally, we asked which of these brands are perceived as expensive, and that is the size of the bubble. You can see from looking at this perceptual map that there is definitely a strong relationship between these measures. Apple is certainly an outlier here, with the most people perceiving them as being high quality. However, because they are also one of the more expensive, or in this case the most perceived as expensive brand, their likelihood to recommend is actually on par with some of the other brands like Dell, Lenovo, and HP, who, while being perceived lower in quality, because they are also lower in price, have higher recommendations. A brand like Sony in this chart has moderate quality, but is perceived as having a higher cost relative to Dell and HP and Lenovo, and therefore have lower likelihood to recommend. Now let's take a look at mobile communication. So from a familiarity perspective, when it comes to mobile communication, BlackBerry is again the highest in terms of familiarity with 86%, followed by Apple at 71% and Motorola at 52%. And you can see the other brands that follow. Looking at that same perceptual map, there is a very interesting, almost linear relationship here where you see high quality and likelihood to recommend. The interesting thing about this is that that perception of expensive or high price for Apple does not seem to be impacting their likelihood to recommend as much as it did in the other category, because they are still the highest likelihood to recommend and the highest quality and the most expensive. Followed by BlackBerry and HTC, which have high likelihood to recommend and high quality, then Motorola, Samsung, LG, Nokia, and then finally Palm. So to summarize the research, again, we did find that IT decision makers on LinkedIn are in fact one of the most connected and active audiences on the platform. We saw that they had anywhere from 5 to 3 times as many connections. They were actively mining those connections from trusted relationships from colleagues to make IT decisions on various products and services. And in fact, we saw that they did plan to spend significant budget on IT hardware in 2011. and we'll see some of those shifts in our 2012 study. So with that, we're actually ahead of schedule a bit, but I want to thank you for attending our IT hardware study webcast. And we could have covered a couple of other of those categories because we had some additional time. But if you want more information on seeing how customers are successfully meeting their marketing objectives with LinkedIn, please visit the site marketing.linkedin.com/successstories. Or to learn more about this audience, or for a copy of this presentation or some of those other categories, please email marketingsolutions@linkedin.com. And I'll be happy to answer any questions now. Sorry, I'm just reading through one here. So the first question is from Bobby Gunasakar. I hope I'm not butchering that too bad. And the question is, how do these IT decision makers get information about products or service? Is it through QA forums, or are you suggesting that we should post information about our products on our company page on LinkedIn? So I think that's a good question. It wasn't specifically answered in this study. We saw the areas of the site that IT professionals were going to. In some of the other research that I've been conducting, it falls into, I think, 3 areas that I know of. One is exactly like you're talking about here, looking at company pages on LinkedIn. The other is groups and forums, as you're suggesting. And then the last one is through LinkedIn Today, which is a service where LinkedIn members can see what's happening in their industry and get news and information that way. And I believe a lot of it is also when you see that inbox data and the profile data, it's just directly reaching out through questions on the network to their peers with questions. Looking for the next question. William Leah asks, can you talk more about the individual pages that the IT decision makers visit? I think the data, the deepest data that we have in this study is really looking at those areas of pages that the IT decision makers are visiting. So we don't have any information in this study on specific pages within the site, but those broad categories are what we have. Julia Kuwinski, you guys have such hard last names, I apologize for butchering that, has similar research been done for software category? And the answer is yes, we did do an IT software study, which is available. So if you send an email to the email that's up, which is marketingsolutions@linkedin.com, we can send that to you. Monica asks, what is the best way to market on LinkedIn to these folks? I can give you my perspective, but I think probably the best way is to reach out to a sales executive here at LinkedIn who really is an expert in reaching these individuals. But I think a combination of advertising directly to them because we have so much reach, but also using some of the more earned media products that we have, such as company pages. But I think the best way to get that answer would probably be to reach out to a sales executive. So Michael Gonzalez is asking, have we seen any data on IT spending and co-location? And unfortunately in this study we do not have any data on that, Michael. But that's something that we can take under advisement for the follow-up study that we're going to be doing. Eric asks, is there a plan to redo the study with newer data? And the answer is yes. We'll be redoing the study in early 2012, I believe is the plan, to refresh the data, and then we'll actually have trended data year over year. From Heather, which is, with information that the CXOs are the final decision makers, but their IT teams strongly influence the outcome of the decisions, what common titles do the IT teams have? And is their usage different from that of the C-level decision makers? From our research, the titles that we were seeing and pulled were things like manager, IT director, and IT VP. Those were the titles that we included. There is likely a broader range of titles that if you're interested in targeting those individuals, I'm sure a sales rep could help you figure out what the range of those would be. The data, there's a question that says, the data that we showed, is it available? Are we selling the data? The data is available. You just need to email marketingsolutions@linkedin.com, and we will be happy to send you the full deck, including the other areas like servers and network devices and landline communications and printers that were not covered here. Okay, great. Well, I think that covers all the questions. I'm glad we were able to do it in short order here and get you back to either starting your days on the West Coast or continuing your days on the East Coast. Thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to hearing from you so that we can continue to provide you with these insights. Have a nice day.